Israel Finkelstein is a leading figure in the archaeology and history of ancient Israel. Over 40 years of fieldwork and research, he has helped to change the way archaeology is conducted, the Bible is interpreted, and the history of Israel is reconstructed. I sat down with Israel over several sessions to talk about how a lifetime of work has informed the story of ancient Israel. Israel, welcome back to the Albright.
Good to be here.
Last time we looked at the United Monarchy and various aspects of its three main kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. We saw that the biblical United Monarchy is not very well founded. Today, taking that into consideration, I want to step back and start a long conversation about the emergence of Israel and Judah as two separate kingdoms in their own right. Can you give us an introduction?
The most important thing to say, to depart from, is that when we are dealing with Israel and Judah, we need to remember that we should make a separation between the biblical story and reality on the ground. The Bible describes Israel and Judah from the perspective of Judah, after Israel is no more. The writing is post-720, so Israel was really taken over by Assyria, it is no more, and the Judahites take over, so to speak, the heritage of the two Hebrew kingdoms and promote their own ideology. And when you read the Bible, it looks as if Judah is the big story and Israel is some sort of, another Hebrew kingdom that needs to be dealt with. However, from the point of view of the facts on the ground, when I say facts on the ground, I speak about the ancient Near East and archaeology. So ancient Near Eastern texts and archaeology, both of them show us that Israel was the big story. Israel was the most important of the two Hebrew kingdoms. Not only that, one of the most important kingdoms in the southern Levant in the Iron Age. Israel was bigger than Judah from the point of view of territory, from the point of view of demography, population. Of course, Israel was stronger from the military point of view. The economy was more prosperous and so on. So Israel is the big story and Judah is on the side. The meaning of this is that when we come to deal with Israel and Judah in the Iron Age, the two Hebrew kingdoms, the first point that needs to be stressed is the importance of being liberated from the ideological construct and the theology of the Judahite authors of late monarchic times in Jerusalem after Israel is no more. And once we are liberated, we understand, of course, as you mentioned, that the description of the United Monarchy is not exactly an historical account. It is more some sort of an ideological construct of what's going to happen in the future of Judah, of Jerusalem as the center of the universe, so to speak, from the point of view of the authors of the biblical account. So we need to be liberated from this construct, and so also to be liberated from the idea of the secession of Israel from the United Monarchy. In other words, we are speaking apparently about the two Hebrew kingdoms rising, emerging in parallel, one next or near the other in the late 10th century BC. So in other words, we are speaking in parallel of Judah of the Davidites, of the Davidic dynasty, and Israel of the many dynasties, and we will get to it later.
As we've seen several times, especially in our early discussions, this is a phenomenon that keeps happening over and over again in the longue durée. A kingdom in the north and a kingdom in the south.
Absolutely. I think that this is I would say that this is the longue durée at its best, which means this had probably been the situation starting in the early Bronze Age of two main centers in the central part of the Highlands, let's say between the Beersheba Valley in the south and the Jezreel Valley in the north, in the territory that will become eventually Israel and Judah. We have two main centers as early as the early Bronze Age. Then again in the Middle Bronze Age, already probably Jerusalem and Shechem in the north. Of course, in the late Bronze Age, we see the same pattern when we look at the Amarna tablets, and this continues into the beginning of the Iron Age. And in fact, the two Hebrew kingdoms of Israel and Judah, they continue this pattern of two Amarna age, 14th century, late Bronze Age centers of Shechem and Jerusalem.
When does that longue durée pattern cease to apply?
When the territorial kingdoms emerge. And then, of course, the next question should be, what is the difference between a city-state and a territorial kingdom? Because one of the most important factors to evaluate in the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age is the transition from this pattern of city-states, of course in the late Bronze Age under Egyptian hegemony, and territorial kingdoms of the Iron Age, because in the Bronze Age we have the many in the southern Levant city-states of Megiddo and Hatzor and Akko, and then farther south Lachish and Gat and Gezer and so on. There are many more. And in the Iron Age, this turns to be a different situation with the Judah, Israel, and then of course Damascus in the north, and the Transjordanian territories, territorial kingdoms of Ammon, Moab, and Edom. And the question is basically how a city-state becomes a territorial kingdom. I think that at least for the southern Levant west of the Jordan River, a territorial kingdom emerges when a city-state in the highlands expands to the lowlands and takes over several small city-states in the lowlands, which means we get a situation of a center in the highlands ruling over territory which includes parts of the lowlands of the southern Levant.
Compare for us the attempted territorial expansion in the Amarna period with the northern kingdom's expansion. How would they compare, contrast?
We are very lucky to have the Amarna tablets, because the Amarna tablets, we spoke about it several times in the past, open for us this window of opportunities to understand what was going on in the Bronze Age in a very detailed way in a certain perspective. So what do we see in the Amarna tablets for the northern territory of the Central Highlands, the area where Israel is going to emerge? We see this ruler of Shechem in the north. His name is Labayo, and then his two sons after him. And they do exactly what we are speaking about. They try to take advantage of certain situation in Canaan at that time and expand to the lowlands, take over other city-states or influence other city-states. And in fact, they are already in the 14th century in the business of establishing a territorial kingdom. However, this project, so to speak, of Shechem of the Amarna period failed because the Egyptian empire reacted to the danger and crashed the attempt of Shechem to expand to the north, to the valleys, because the meaning of expanding to the valley was that the Highlanders were risking the Egyptian interests, especially along the main highway to the north. However, when we turn from the Amarna period as an example of a situation like this to the period later in the 10th century, so we are 350 years or so, or 400 years after the Amarna period, and we have the same situation rolling, same situation developing in the northern part of the Central Highlands. However, this time there is no Egypt, which means that we are in a sort of a gap between domination of big forces in the Levant. Before, in the Bronze Age, Egypt, and later, starting in the middle of the 8th century, if not a little bit before, Assyria. And in the 10th century, we are there in the middle between, and there is this possibility for a city-state in the highlands to expand and establish a territorial kingdom, and this is exactly what happens. And in fact, when we look at the details, I think that we can see really almost one-to-one the attempts of Shechem of the Amarna age, again in the 10th century, but this time successful, which means we see expansion of Highlanders into the lowland. When I say lowlands, I mean Jezreel Valley to the north of Shechem, and also probably to certain parts of the coastal plain, and there's nobody there to object, so to speak. So this is the moment when the city-state of Shechem becomes the territorial kingdom of Israel.
So what do we see archaeologically and textually?
Archaeologically, we see this mainly in the Jezreel Valley. The situation there is the following. After the collapse of the late Bronze Age, the Bronze Age collapse in the very late 12th century, around 1100 BC, after a while, we have this revival of Canaanite, so to speak, life, second millennium BC material culture, and also the same pattern of city-states. What do I mean? I mean that the same city-states that were important in the Bronze Age, Megiddo included, decline in the Bronze Age collapse and then come back to life. And they are, again, the same places which are the center of ruling over their territory around them, some villages and so on. So they are again city-states. And this comes to an end sometime in the 10th century BC in a wave of big destructions all over the Jezreel Valley. The destructions are not at the same time. So we are not speaking apparently about some sort of a military campaign of, let's say, some suggested, including me in the past, wrongly, I should say that this is the result of the Sheshonq campaign in the second half of the 10th century. Once we saw the radiocarbon results from the destruction layers, we understood that this is a process rather than an event. And it is a process that probably took about 50, 60, 70 years within the 10th century BC until all of these city-states in the Jezreel Valley were destroyed. And then, if we are dealing with the process, we have two questions to answer. What happens after the process should illuminate the process and what was there before. And secondly, we should also ask who are the people who are taking over these city-states in the lowlands in the Jezreel Valley. So the first question is very easy to answer. When these city-states are destroyed completely in the 10th century, this is the swan song of the Bronze Age situation of the second millennium BC. And what comes instead is something new, material culture, even from the material culture point of view. And what we get is the material culture which is going to continue into the period of the two Hebrew kingdoms, in the case of the north, the kingdom of Israel in the 9th and 8th centuries BC. So we can absolutely call the people who settled at Megiddo in the late 10th century after this second destruction, Israelites already. So the answer, of course, is very clear also for the second question then, that the people who took over the Jezreel Valley came from the Highlands. So we are speaking exactly about this process of Highlanders taking over the Jezreel Valley and the city-states and establishing their territorial kingdom. From the point of view of the biblical text, there are clues that this happened also in the southwest, which means in the coastal plain, in the area, let's say, of Gezer, the area somewhere in the Ayalon Valley between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem in modern perspective. Because there are two chronistic verses in the book of Kings telling about siege by a northern king over a small town facing Philistia in the southwest. The name of the town is Gibton. And because we are dealing with the chronistic verses, there is good reason to argue that they indeed preserve some sort of historical memory. And if this is the situation, so it's a good clue that this early northern kingdom also tried to expand in the direction of Philistia.
A few episodes ago, you suggested or hypothesized that the concept of Saul underlies this expansion point.
Indeed, I think that had there been a territorial kingdom already in the time of Saul, or attempts to establish a territorial kingdom in the 10th century before the rise of the northern kingdom, from a center somewhere north of Jerusalem. So one of the expansion projects of this house of soul possibility that we were speaking about was in the direction of the coastal plain, in the direction of Philistia. And you may remember that we mentioned the site of Khirbet Kayafa as a possible example, a possible piece of evidence for this North Israelite expansion in the direction of Philistia.
We saw also that this Saulite entity was put to a quick end by the Egyptians.
Indeed, and this is the moment to remember that we are dealing, when we speak about Judah and Israel, we are dealing with two different geographical situations and demographic situations starting early, starting already definitely in the Bronze Age, but even more so in the beginning of the Iron Age. Judah is one big, remote, isolated block ruled from Jerusalem, and hence it is not surprising that we are dealing with one dynasty apparently ruling over a very long period of time. In the north, situation is different because we are dealing with the more complex geographical background of valleys and ridges and the possibilities to go to the lowlands, main roads penetrating into the highlands. So we are dealing, in fact, with, first of all, several attempts to establish a territorial kingdom. Even before Saul, we spoke, if you remember, about the Shiloh Shechem territorial entity of the 11th century BC, then the House of Saul territorial entity possibly in the 10th century, beginning of the 10th century, and from there to the rise of the Northern Kingdom. So the question indeed is what happened that one declined and the other one came to being. The answer is, and I refer here to one of our previous conversations, so let's be short about this at this point, that my speculation theory is that we are dealing here indeed with some sort of involvement of Egypt in Canaan in the second half of the 10th century, middle to second half, because there was this revival in Egypt and attempts to re-establish the great empire, Egyptian empire in the Levant, with the rise of the 22nd dynasty, Egyptian dynasty, and especially with the first king in the dynasty, Sheshonq the first, the biblical Shishak. And we raised the possibility, if you remember, that Shishak was behind the decline of the northern, of this House of Saul entity of the first half of the 10th century, and the rise of the territorial kingdom. And here we have to mention, and I suggest that we'll get back to it in a minute, we have even sort of clues in the biblical material for the association of the first king of the Northern Kingdom, Jeroboam I, with Egypt, and specifically with Sheshonq I, the founder of the 22nd dynasty.
The Egyptian influence at this time was pretty ephemeral, and eventually a stable kingdom does emerge in the north. The most stable one that we have good evidence for is, of course, the Omeride kingdom in the middle of the 9th century. But there's a little bit of a gap there of about 50 years and several kings that are mentioned in the biblical text before the Omerides, which we'll get to. Can you say anything about those guys?
Indeed, when we speak about the Northern Kingdom, we can divide the conversation into the period before the Omerides, and then what happens after the Omerides with the 8th century and so on. We'll get to it later. But the first 50 years are interesting because they are the most enigmatic and the most difficult to identify in the field, so to speak, which means archaeologically, from the archaeological point of view of archaeology. So before the Omerides came to power around 880 BC, and we put the line of rise of the Northern Kingdom, let's say around 930 if we follow the biblical numbers. And I think that since we are dealing with exact numbers, so to speak, even for the early monarchs, there should be a very strong reason why not to accept the biblical order of things. This also comes from my understanding of the source of information for the author of the Book of Kings, and maybe we'll get to it when we speak about the 8th century BC. In any event, we are speaking about 50 years with 6 monarchs. However, this is a very unstable situation with revolts, uprisings, dynasty comes to power, dynasty falls, another dynasty. This is typical to the situation in the Northern Kingdom, especially in the beginning. From the 6 rulers of the beginning, 2 are especially important, and I think that need to be discussed. The first one is Jeroboam I, and the second one is Baasha. Jeroboam first because he's the founder, and I think that there is something very unique also in the attitude, I should say negative attitude of the biblical authors to this Jeroboam. There is another thing which is unique, why there are 2 Jeroboams. There is Jeroboam first, and then there is another Jeroboam, Jeroboam second. So we need to put the spotlight for a minute on this guy, Jeroboam, the founder. And then Baasha, only because the Bible tells us that he ruled for a long period of time, relatively speaking, and also because we may be able now to identify him archaeologically.
Let's talk about Jeroboam first, since he's the founder after all. Are you suggesting he's an historical figure?
Yes, I do. And Jeroboam first is interesting because he's the founder and because there are 2 Jeroboams, first and second. So I think we need to speak about him a little bit. But here again, there is some sort of a preliminary condition to discussing Jeroboam, or 2 conditions to discussing Jeroboam. First of all, to be liberated from the negative attitude of the biblical author to Jeroboam first. We are dealing with history, not theology, and the negative attitude comes from the idea in Jerusalem after Israel is no more that this northern kingdom was illegitimate and the kings were not legitimate. So, and Jeroboam first was the founder, so he is really the most villain of them all, of the northern kings. And you know, according to the Deuteronomistic history, the ultimate sin of the northern kingdom which leads eventually to the collapse of the northern kingdom, is the sin of Jeroboam. That is to say, the establishment of the 2 extra Jerusalem cult places at Dan and Bethel. So we need to put this aside for a minute. We also need, since we do not accept, I do not accept the description of the United Monarchy as an historical one, I also put aside the association of Jeroboam with Solomon and also the association with Rehoboam, the first king in Jerusalem after King Solomon. So the spotlight should be on Jeroboam. What do we know about him? Not very much.
Well, what exactly do we know, and is it only coming from the biblical text?
Yes, about Jeroboam from the biblical text, but not only from the Masoretic account. You know that we have the Masoretic text in the first book of Kings, chapters 11 and 12, speaking about the rise of Jeroboam I to power. Here we have something very peculiar also in the Greek version, in the Septuagint. The Greek version of the story of Jeroboam is much longer, much more detailed than the Masoretic. And this is called in biblical research circles the alternative history. And there we know far more than in the Masoretic text. And it's really interesting. Of course, there is always the question whether the Septuagint version about Jeroboam comes from a parallel historical document not known to us today, or whether it's all a midrash, an ancient midrash, which means interpretation of the biblical text of the chapters in the first book of Kings in the Masoretic text. We don't really know. What we do know about him, apparently, he comes from a sort of a small village in the southern part of the territory of the later northern kingdom, of his later northern kingdom, the rugged terrain today to the northwest, I would say, of Ramallah, the seat of the Palestinian Authority. in the Highlands. The way he is described in the alternative history may hint that we are dealing with another Apiru-like character, a leader of outlaws, active on the margin of what's going to become the Northern Kingdom. In circumstances that are not very clear to us, he needs apparently to run away to Egypt. This is hinted, told in details in the alternative text, in the Septuagint, but also hinted at in the Masoretic text. He runs to Sheshonq I in Egypt, and then later he comes back and apparently coronated, according to my understanding, at Shechem. The coronation of Rehoboam is already interpretation of the text or editing of the text by a Judahite author of later times. And then the text also says that he establishes the two abominations, the cult centers of Dan and Bethel. There is no way that this is historical, because Dan did not become, according to archaeology, Israelite until the 8th century. We are dealing here about 150 years earlier. And also Bethel was not imported at all, according to my evaluation of the archaeological material, in the late 10th century BC. So this apparently is retrojection of situations later by the author of the Book of Kings into the time of Jeroboam I. Then there is another clue. The story, the Masoretic text says that he built Penuel in Transjordan and Shechem. This is possible, there is no way to know, but in any event, all in all, when we wrap this figure together, we see somebody who is involved with Egypt, who could have been put on the ground by Egypt as a result of the new interest, as some sort of a vassal of the Egyptian regime of the time of Sheshonq I. The Egyptians remained in power in the southern Levant for a while, not for long, because after Sheshonq, this project of making Egypt great again failed, so to speak, in Canaan. So for maybe 20, 30 years, no more than that, and then the Northern Kingdom is liberated. So if I may say so, from Sheshonq, remember that there is this Sheshonq block at Megiddo, probably in the layer which can be associated indeed with the early kings of the Northern Kingdom. So this is a clue that comes from archaeology. And we can also say that this Jeroboam I rules over territory which is limited to the northern part of the Central Highlands, Transjordan in the Gilead, and the Jezreel Valley, of course, Megiddo included. Not yet to Hatzor, farther in the north to the Galilee, not yet to Dan, even farther away to the north.
You spoke about two kings that you want to emphasize. Tell us something about Baasha.
Yeah, Baasha is no less difficult to crack than Jeroboam I. However, we don't have the same animosity of the biblical author to Baasha as to Jeroboam I. What we know about Baasha comes mainly in the first book of Kings from the perspective of the south in the time of King Asa. King Asa rules in Jerusalem in the late 10th, beginning of the 9th century, which means around 900, a little bit before BC. And in his time, Baasha, his opponent from the north, according to the text, invades the territory of Judah and builds some sort of a fortress right to the north of Jerusalem, blocking the way of Jerusalem to the north. And then Asa is in trouble. He calls on Aram in the north, on the kingdom of Aram, to come to the rescue. And Ben-Hadad, the Aramean king, campaigns against Baasha. There is a list of places that he takes on the way in his campaign. And then, of course, Asa pays him from the treasures of the temple in order to make him come and rescue him. And then, as a result, Baasha pulls back, withdraws, and Asa takes the blocks of the fortress of Ramah, north of Jerusalem, dismantles this place, and builds two fortresses a little bit farther to the north on the border between Israel and Judah, that is to say Geba and Mitzpah. Now, this story in the first book of Kings is very problematic for two reasons. First of all is the mention of this Ben-Hadad. Because of this Ben-Hadad, in traditional biblical, in conservative biblical scholarship, we can read about the first Ben-Hadad and the second and the third. However, we historically, from the ancient Near Eastern text, we know about one Bar-Hadad or Ben-Hadad, and he is the son of Hazael, who ruled in the very late 9th century BC. So one can doubt whether there was another Ben-Hadad in the beginning of the 9th century, around, let's say, 885 BC, something like that, conventional chronology. Secondly, no less important, is the list of places that are mentioned in the campaign of this Ben-Hadad against Baasha. The list is similar in a very peculiar way to the list given to us in a later biblical verse about the campaign of Tiglath-Pileser III, king of Assyria, against the northern kingdom in the 30s of the 8th century BC. And this is typically an historical, of course, event. So one can argue, can doubt whether maybe the description of the campaign of Ben-Hadad on the northern kingdom, in fact, is a copy of a later source describing the campaign of Tiglath-Pileser III. So what do we have? We are left with very little about Baasha, a little bit of his dealings in the southwest of his territory. Possibly he indeed tried to press Judah, though we don't really have a solid piece of evidence for that. However, here comes a big however, we know about Baasha recently quite a lot, relatively speaking, from archaeology.
All right, what does archaeology tell us about these first 50 years, since you've taken away all of the textual sources?
So I'm speaking about Baasha. You are not going to be surprised, my dear Matt, that I'm coming from Megiddo. Okay. The two of us. What we see comes not only from Megiddo, but Megiddo is a very important site because at Megiddo, we, the two of us and our staff, we managed to really establish a very good chronology for the phase that we call Iron 2A. This is the phase in the beginning of the Iron Age, the time of the beginning of the two Hebrew kingdoms, let's say, between the 30s of the 10th century and around 800 BC. And in this period of time, at Megiddo, we managed to distinguish four phases. And this is exceptional, the only site which allows to distinguish stratigraphy in such an accurate way for the late 10th and 9th century BC. Now, there is a phase in the beginning, and then there is the phase of the Archaeological, where we see already, the prosperity and monumental building activity with the Megiddo palaces. We'll get to it later. In between, we managed to identify a phase, which we now call Middle Iron 2A. Asaf Kleiman, my student, whom you know very well, and me, we describe it as Middle Iron 2A, and it is radiocarbon dated. Yes, we need to remember that the phases at Megiddo are also very well radiocarbon dated. And this one is dated around 900 BC. So this is the time of King Baasha. And this is why Asaf and me wrote an article under the title, The Archaeology of Baasha with a question mark. What's interesting to see is that we already can identify the first steps in the direction of significant architecture. I wouldn't say monumental, but still significant architectural activity. And secondly, already strong connections with the coast, including import of Cypriot pottery at that time. So there is this first development from the very beginning in the direction of what we are going to see in the time of the Archaeological dynasty.
Let's take this opportunity to summarize these first 50 years, and the next time we'll talk about the next 50 years of the Archaeological dynasty.
I think that the most important point to stress when we speak about the first 50 years, about the beginning of the Northern Kingdom, is the territorial aspect. What were the boundaries of the Northern Kingdom in this early phase of its existence? We are speaking about the northern part of the Central Highlands, the Gilead in Transjordan, and the Jezreel Valley and surroundings. This is basically the territory. Not yet the big expansion, neither in the southeast to Moab, nor in the north east to in the direction of Damascus, not in the north in the direction of Phoenicia. This is important because there is something to pay attention to from the perspective of the biblical text. Many of the foundation important texts of the Northern Kingdom that are now found in the biblical account, in the Jerusalemite, in the Judite, Deuteronomistic history, but taken from the north, concentrate on the same territory. What do I mean? I mean the early Jacob cycle as a northern foundation myth. I mean the royal tradition of King Saul. I mean the royal tradition, possible royal tradition of Jeroboam I, because we have the negative attitude to Jeroboam I, but we can assume that in the Northern Kingdom, Jeroboam I was the most important king. He was the one who established, their beloved kingdom in the late 10th century BC. And he is still in the same territory. Even more so, the whole tradition, we will speak about this, the tradition of the northern saviors and the small judges, minor judges, in the book of Judges, the territory where the stories take place is also the same territory. So we, I think, can suggest that here we are dealing with the core territory of the Northern Kingdom, not only from the point of view of our perspective as researchers, as we see it from historical account and our understanding of the biblical text and archaeology, but also from their own perspective, the way that they looked at their history and their core territory.
Great. We'll take some time later to look at each of those core myths in some detail. For now, let's wrap up today. Next time, I want to talk about the Omride dynasty, a time when this northern kingdom of Israel will move out of this core territory that you've been talking about. Thanks for coming.